it away.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Meredith. I'm a fellow alum, just like Meredith, a few years before her, though. I am class of 1999. So quick math. Yes, my reunion is coming up in April. And I am also the first woman president of the Tepper Alumni Board. I think the only woman at this point. I'm going to say first, though, and be optimistic. Tepper is a big part of my life in a lot of ways. So my daughter graduated from CMU in last May. And so I kind of have this 360 view as a student, as an alumni representative, as a parent, and also as an adjunct. I teach in the entrepreneurship program. I teach the corporate startup lab. I'm one of the adjunct members of that course. Anybody heard of the corporate startup lab as a master's capstone? Cool. And yeah, I can share other things from my background too. That's kind of the fun facts on the CMU side.
Yeah, do you want to share a little more?
Sure, I can share a little bit more.
Yay.
Why not? When I graduated from CMU, my focus was marketing and tech, which today is so ubiquitous, but back in 99, it was kind of the front end of a bigger movement that was coming. And I joined a startup that was acquired. Well, this was a summer internship, and that was my first taste of startup land, but it was acquired 2 weeks before I went to work for Wisewire, which was acquired by the #2 largest search engine at the time, which was Lycos, if that rings a bell, should, because of the CMU connection from way back when. And that's where I got my taste in startups. So rather than creating my own, I had always wanted to orbit entrepreneurs. When I was here, I was president of the Entrepreneurship Club. And we're so fortunate to have this resource of the Swartz Center. And I was a student here, is definitely taking advantage of all things that I could to connect and meet other alums and meet other folks in technology. And so that was my start in the world post MBA. And I'll fast forward kind of 20 plus years here. Most of my career was in growth roles. So leading teams to, use our marketing budget wisely, right? And the smallest budget, I like to joke, was $1 at the startups. That was a joke, but not really. And the largest budget I had was $100 million budget. So that was pretty fun. And eventually I found my way into a CEO role. I was hired in from the outside to a third generation transportation logistics company. They liked that I had an e-commerce background. They liked that I was not maverick, but I was somebody that they thought they could have for the long term and help them change and evolve and innovate in this third generation 125-year-old company. So that's a very exciting beginning for what I thought would be a 20-year career, but ended up to be 3 years. And the reason why it was 3, as the CEO, just to give you size and scope, I was running a business that was over 100 million in revenue, and that was about 10% of the whole company. So it was a pretty big company. And our entire business, not just my unit, but the whole company, was acquired by a global transportation logistics company. And that's what got me started in the world of mergers and acquisitions. Was going through that experience. What does it feel like? What does it look like to get acquired? And again, it was a third generation family business. I wasn't family. I was hired from the outside, but being close to the family and the board and understanding some of the dynamics. Taking that to present day, I call myself the business transition Sherpa. I work with business owners from transition to transaction, from creating value to letting go. This is a complicated thing. It is not easy. It takes time. And a big part of what I do is education. Shocker, right? Given that I'm an adjunct, I have a passion for education. But when it comes to transition planning, exit planning, it's difficult. And there's lots of murky water. So how do I work with clients to help them find clarity? Well, that's the big question. There's lots of answers to that. A big part of what I do is education, as I said. I have a podcast that Meredith was a guest on. If you want to listen to her episode, I would definitely encourage you to do so. You did a great job. And that show is called Succession Stories. And I've also put a lot of things together as an author. I have a book called The Business Transition Handbook. And yeah, really excited to be with you today. So thank you.
Great. I feel much more satiated by that.
Thank
Full meal. I know, I think almost everyone in this room, I'm so happy to see familiar faces. For those that I don't know, I am a faculty member here at Tepper, teach entrepreneurship and innovation classes primarily. I started this family business initiative that Laurie mentioned a few years ago now, and that includes a leadership speaker series, family business peer advisory groups where we welcome business owners from within the CMU community, but also beyond the CMU community to get together every 6 weeks. And a family business course. I am an EIR at the Swartz Center as well, so I love working with students on their startups. And I was a business owner. I had 2 companies that I sold last year, and so I've recently lived through the sell side of this equation, and now I'm actually just starting to venture into the other side as I start to vet potential opportunities. So really, this is very selfish on my part. I get to ask questions and listen to your smart questions and learn with you as I start to explore some opportunities that I'm looking at as well. So our plan was this. I have some questions to sort of grease the wheel here, but really we want to know what your questions are. So I'm going to start by asking Laurie some questions. And as soon as I start to see hands go up, we're going to revert to your questions. Okay. All right. So Laurie, what the heck do we mean by small to middle market when it
Yeah.
comes to businesses?
What does that mean? Well, if you Google it, you'll see ranges of revenue typically, and they won't always match. So I'll give you my point of view and then I'll say you can develop your own. Because if you say what's middle market, then it really ranges, right? So small to mid is this lower end of that. Middle market can be, again, what are these numbers? 50 million in revenue to like 5 billion. That's a really big range. So just to kind of cull it down a bit, let's come up with some other mechanisms getting our head around the marketplace. Businesses that are under 1 million in revenue, and I'm not talking about startups in the garage, okay? I'm talking about the everyday entrepreneur business. These are the businesses we drive by every day, and there's so many of them in the United States that it comprises literally like 50% of the US working population is in these everyday entrepreneurial businesses, okay? So I'm not talking about the big corporates, and I've been there, right? I've been there. We're talking about businesses that are either founder-led or they've been acquired or they've been passed from one generation to the next or acquired by the next generation, I should say, in a family-led business. Those businesses, I kind of strata them as, are they under 1 million? And those are our Main Street businesses. Those are maybe, the barbershops and the restaurants and shops like that, it could be retail, things like that. The next level would be maybe like 2 to 20 million is definitely in the lower middle market. They can sometimes be characterized as Main Street, but I think that 1 million to 2 million in revenue is one level of a threshold that I see in my industry. And I should have mentioned in my intro, I'm a certified mergers and acquisitions advisor. So I'll put that hat on in today's conversation. 2 to 20 million in revenue, 5 to 50 million in revenue is a lot of times the lower middle market. But if you want to be really specific about it and go Google it and so on, you'll see the middle market's a really, really big range. So one way that I kind of mentally slice it is, would an investment banker want to take on your deal? And if it's under 50 million, the answer is in revenue, or, they'll usually say an EBITDA number. So if you want to use rough math, 10% of 50, so it's a 5 million EBITDA company. That's the other, right? An investment banker, a firm that's got a lot of overhead and they're looking for big fish to, big fish, it's got to be worth their while. Typically that's a market under 50 million is not where they're spending their time. Are there exceptions to that? Absolutely. So in answering your question, I hope I did a decent job there. Anything I can expand on? Is that an answer?
Yeah, I think, when we were interviewing investment bankers, we really tried to focus on people who were in our space. And by in our space, I mean, were interested in the kind of business we had and the size we were looking at. And the threshold that we heard a lot at that point was 20 million enterprise value and up. That was the threshold that we needed to be at to work with one of these bankers. And I'm sure, just like you're saying, there are these like rules of thumb. And then there's the market realities. And I'm sure in more fluid years, those benchmarks might move up. And in drier years, maybe, people become more flexible. But that's a number I heard. Does that match with any
Yeah,
of
let
your-
me sort of give some other lay of the land. Let's talk about M&A from a service provider standpoint. So if your company is in the Main Street category, most likely if you want to be represented in a transaction to sell, the type of M&A person would be known as a basically and again, all these terms are kind of interchangeable, so don't hold me to this as the only definitions here, but a broker, right? So a listing broker on aggregate sites, or so these are firms like Murphy's, if you're familiar with Murphy's, or in the South, Sunbelt, I think, is another type of broker where they'll list your business for you, but beyond that, there's not a whole lot of what I'll call white glove services. So the next level of in the lower middle market from an M&A standpoint is what I do. So I'll kind of describe what me and my firm, what we do, and then I'll try to distinguish that from what I'll literally call an investment banker. So some people will say to me, are you an investment banker? And I'm so literal, I say the answer is no, but here's the thing. The work that we do, and I'm with Stony Hill Advisors, the work that I do, and I'll describe as the white glove service that all the investment bankers are doing. We do that too. What we don't do is we're not FINRA licensed, which is, can't give you an acronym what it stands for, but it's SEC, governed, is the securing of the financing, right? So an investment banker will also do, and we can talk about what the process is, but they'll do the process, and then they may also be putting the deal together from a mezzanine lending or, whatever the banking side is. Folks like myself, I'll say I'm an M&A intermediary, okay? I'm an M&A advisor. I never say I'm an M&A investment banker unless someone pushes me to it and they're not really understanding what that means. Because though it can be confusing. So that's why I'm trying to kind of lay out, not everybody's going to work with, you got to find your fit, right? So for me, in this lower middle market space, as an intermediary, I am looking to work with folks in that lower middle market. And let's say, whether it's revenue or deal size, we don't have pretty hard and fast rules. We do work with companies that are under $1 million. We do make exceptions. So it's not always, as you said, it's not always a hard and fast rule. We just find that our sweet spot is kind of that 2 to 20 million or 5 to 50 million in revenue type of business.
Yep.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay. Yeah, take it away.
So it's kind of related to that, and this is validation, just like me not knowing the industry. So what are you doing when you're looking at these companies? What are the details of is it the industry they're in? Is it just revenue based? Is it the loyalty of their customers if they're selling a product, or the growth of how you see it's going to be in X number of years or something?
So we'll repeat the question and then we can dive into the answer just to make sure everybody's heard it. So the question is, as an M&A advisor, what are we looking at when we're evaluating a business, right? So what are the different criteria that we might look at? And you did a great job of articulating a number of those criteria. I'll just start out by saying, I think one of my main value adds for my clients is that I help them see things they're not seeing. And when I'm working with a business owner on the getting ready process, which can take 5, 7 years, it's really not an easy thing to do. And I like to say you can't do exit planning when you're exiting. It's best to begin with the end in mind. So for those of you that are working on startups and thinking about building your business with an exit in the future, I'll definitely encourage you to do that. The more well-established companies that are contemplating a transaction in the future, or, you know, whether it's to family or it's to a third party, it's best to put yourself in the shoes of the buyer. It's really hard though, because we got to look at the roses and the thorns in the business. And who wants to be told their baby's ugly, right? Nobody wants to be told their baby's ugly. But that's part of my job, is to help business owners see what they're not seeing. So what are some of those core criteria? Well, there's 8 core criteria, and there's always going to be more than that, but I can kind of walk through the 8 if you want. Okay, so at a high level, first and foremost is your financial performance. And it's going to be your raw numbers, of course, right? What is your profitability? What are some of those comparatives in your industry? What industry are you in? And the multiples we see are definitely impacted by what industry you're in. I'll talk about why in a second. And also the size of your business. I have data that shows an inflection point at 25 million in revenue. So the multiples are kind of here. And then all of a sudden, there's this little hockey stick at 25 million in revenue. So one of the main things for businesses that are under 2 million in revenue, again, just as a ballpark, is that buyers might perceive that those businesses are less transferable. The larger your company is, or the more years you have as an established entity, if you're the sole proprietor, you can understand why that's a challenge, right? If I'm the only one who knows how to deliver this product or service, and I'm looking to sell my business, they're going to say, well, you're the only one who knows how to kick that machine and get it to work, right? What's going to be the value and the transferability of that business? So one of the things that we're trying to find in our own look at our company is, well, what's transferable? You know, what have we built? And then what's the value to the buyer? So when we think about value to the buyer, it could be a number of things. It can be pain points that your business is solving for them. When you're not in the room, guess what the buyers are asking themselves, okay? I don't care what kind of company you have. They're wondering if they can build what you've built, or is it going to be more beneficial for them to acquire you and stitch you into what they're doing? Build versus buy. So what are some of those dimensions that we might be curious about to see, well, what pain points are we solving? Well, maybe there's a growth potential that you've demonstrated. It's not just wishing it to happen, but you have data that is demonstrating this growth potential. And I'll make up some numbers. Let's say you've got 10% market share in the market you're serving, but you're demonstrating that they have an ability to capture that. Yeah, we're hearing some laughter and it's not at me, but I don't know if I'm like picking it up. So we're going to see if we can quiet that down. So growth potential is definitely part of it. Is there field left to plow? Cash flow is really important. There's an inverse relationship between your cash flow needs in the business and your multiple. Businesses that are cash flow rich are not borrowing as much money, right? Taking on less debt, not saying all debt's bad. It's not. It's just, again, what needs does your business have? Financial buyers in particular, we can talk about types of buyers in a moment, but financial buyers in particular are looking for a more predictable stream of future cash flow. So a minute ago, I said, well, you know, it depends what industry you're in. So for those of you who are creating software companies or a part of software companies or other businesses that may have a SaaS platform, that business model is typically a recurring revenue business model. And you put your credit card in and you set it and forget it, Netflix, right? And isn't that an amazing thing? That predictable stream of future cash flow. And so financial buyers, like many buyers, are looking for that. And we might see a multiple of revenue as a result, as opposed to a multiple on profit. We can talk more about valuations in a minute. So I can go on and on and on about value drivers. I've only given you 3, and there's 5 more. So I'm happy to talk more about the other 5, but does that give you a flavor of, yeah.
Other questions from through here? Allison.
What are typical add backs that you see in a transaction? How do you sell, present, and value intangibles?
So the question is, how do we present add backs? And I probably should start with a definition because maybe some of you might not know what an add back is. So let's start there. We are looking at your financial statements, which is why also I should mention on the financial side, it isn't just about your numbers and your industry and your size. It's also about the quality of your reporting. I don't really have an opinion on the type, like QuickBooks can be great, but if your QuickBooks is a mess and it's inconsistent, then it's not great. So I'm not saying everybody needs to go get the most expensive accounting firm, okay? We have to right size what our needs are, but we want to be consistent about it and we want to be thorough about it. So that's really important. So let's assume that our financial reporting is solid. Yay. Okay. We're going to take a look at our income statement. We're going to take a look at our balance sheet. When it comes to the income statement, if I'm doing evaluation for a privately held company, I can't go to the Yahoo Finance and look up a price, right? So this is kind of a trick question. How do we price, how do we price a business? Well, there's an infinite in the private market. There's an infinite number of prices, right? Because it's up to the buyer. So when we do valuations, there are 3 core methodologies. And the one that we use most often is a market-based approach. It's finding a range of value based on comps in the industry and other factors. And most often, we will see that valuations are based on an EBITDA number. If anybody wants me to define EBITDA, I can. It's essentially the net profit number before taxes, depreciation, interest, kind of clears out some of the non-cash stuff. And then the question is, well, what are some other add backs that would change our bottom line? So let's say that we put on a new roof last year. Your business put on a new roof. It cost you $30,000. Well, you're not going to put on a new roof every year. It's probably 10 to 20 years. So we're going to add that expense. We're going to take it out, right? We're not going to show that expense. Now on the revenue side, a great example is PPP money. If any of you are familiar with, we got these grants from the government. Well, we can't count that as revenue or income. We have to make sure that's not included. Well, another example on the revenue side is, what if your company got the biggest job ever, your construction company, and you got the biggest job ever, and it was, 2 to 3 times your normal project size. And the likelihood of that project happening again is really not likely. Well, in fairness, we probably need to take that out of your revenue also. So it can be pluses or minuses. Another category of add backs is things related to the owner. That's why interest is not included, because a different owner might make different decisions about the debt that they want to take on in the business or investing decisions, right? So interest expense and then interest gained. Other things around the owner, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because it all ties in, I should say, to like the pillars of transition, or there's really 3 core pillars: personal, financial, and business. And if your intentions as the business owner, and we can use your example, right? Your intentions was to not stay on full time, right?
Mm-hmm.
You exited the business at the closing, is that correct?
Right.
Okay. So in Meredith's example, she decided that staying on wasn't, part of her package. It wasn't important to her. Other owners might make a different decision. So in her add backs, it would be completely fair that her salary and taxes associated with her salary and her benefits and her perks, maybe I'm making this up. Maybe she had a car and she had a management organization she was a part of that cost, $20,000 a year. And maybe there's some travel related things that her family did that they took as personal expenses. Business owners have the ability to put some personal expenses through the business. So we want to know what business related expenses might not be repeatable and what personal things might not be repeatable. And here's the caveat though. The buyers are going to go, well, wait a minute, we need to replace Meredith. So we have to add back a manager, a general manager or someone. Now, maybe that at less money than maybe she was making. So just to be fair, again, that could be part of the add back analysis. And we would typically call that adjusted EBITDA. Long answer, but you guys are smart cookies and I know you like to know the details.
The add backs can be significant. We looked at a company that slightly profitable, but had a significant number of family members drawing salaries that were maybe loosely associated to some market, but far above, presumably replacement rate. So especially I think in family business, where part of the goal of the business is to support potentially family members, these add backs can be a significant piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, dollar to dollar, it's funny with business owners because, and I use this example because it's so extreme. Let's say you've got toilet paper expense going through your company and it's for your home. So you're charging your business for your toilet paper. Okay, well, you've spent $1 to save 30 cents. But if your business is at a 3x multiple of profit, well, you've kind of taken that dollar, which could have been $3 of value. So one of the things that I think business owners have to be mindful of is, yeah, maybe we're trying to minimize taxes and that's a strategy. But then when you're showing no profit, when a buyer looks at that, they're going to go, oh, that's interesting. So just be mindful of those decisions.
These are great questions, Jaime.
Would you be in the camp of always separating your personal expenses, business expenses, and not intermingling them that way? Or what sort of expenses would you recommend? Let's say you already own the business, what recommendation would you have?
So the question is what recommendation might we have for expenses, personal expenses that are going through the business? And should we intermingle or not? I'm a big fan of tracking. So if you have a different account, like a different credit card or a different account in your general ledger of how you're tracking your expenses, as long as they are in a bucket, I think that's ideal because it's going to make your job so much easier when it's time to do an add back exercise. You'll already know the answers. I had a client in Pennsylvania and he owns a residential construction company. So you can see where I'm going with this, right? The landscaping and building the barn and right, and all this commingling. And we worked on helping him separate his accounts. So we didn't tell him, hey, don't do that. We said, just keep track of that better.
If you're working with your clients, do you ever advise them on any like low-hanging fruit that they can do before the transaction to garner them a greater multiple or a greater valuation? And I guess, what might some of those low-hanging fruit be?
The question is are there any low-hanging fruit we can go after prior to a transaction or sale? Absolutely. Thank you for that. I should pay you $10. Yeah, that is the question of the day. Yeah, absolutely. My encouragement to any company, not just family businesses, is be mindful, if you're beginning with the end in mind, right? To quote Stephen Covey, how can we work on the things we need to work on? How can we look in the mirror today to see what we need to work on? How do we identify? So for me in my practice, I have some assessments that I use with business owners to help them get a quantitative score, which is really fun for all of us who love math here in Carnegie Mellon. We can get a quantitative score across 8 value drivers. I've mentioned 3 so far. There's, again, 5 more I can hit on. Across all of these 8 drivers, if you choose to see the results of it, we'll give you a comparative numeric score on your industry. What is your industry that you're in? Because they're all different, right? And for your industry, how do you compare to your peer group overall on a point scale of 0 to 100? And then for each of these 8 drivers, what's your point score? And it's really interesting to kind of get that measure. And then what's super cool about it, and I licensed this platform. I wish I could say I created it, but I didn't. I licensed it. Is we can tie that to business value. So we get an estimate of value. If you're a startup and you don't have revenue yet, we probably, wouldn't want to go through that exercise on the financials. But if you have a well-established business with at least 3 years of data, we can do an estimate of value. It's kind of a black box. I can't tell you exactly on how all the math works, but generally speaking, it's from the things we were just talking about, right? Your EBITDA measures with some multiplier on it, with some add backs too. And that's super cool because also we can do some scenario planning, which says, wow, what if we changed value driver 7 to this? Or what if we change value driver 8 and literally see how we can move the needle and not even change financials? And so when you can improve financials and improve these other things, then you can really see the compounding effects. So that's really exciting. And then that gives us a roadmap of how to make improvements and what to focus on.
Sorry. Does that ever elongate kind of the timeline for the transaction to take place or your timeline and working with that client?
Everybody's timeline is going to be different because it's always about where you're starting from, and there might be a lot of goodness in what's in your business today. And if you have a buyer knocking on your door and they're interested now and your business has a lot of really good assets and things that can transfer, you might decide, sometimes you say, well, I'm going to stay the course and I'm going to continue to grow and hold this steady. And other times you'll say, you know what, for all the right reasons, I'm going to pursue this just to see if a transaction makes sense. It depends on what you hear and how that lands for you, whether or not you choose that you want to keep going and growing or, cash out. Yeah.
Did you cover the other 5 criteria?
Yeah, people like teasers, don't they? Okay, yeah, I can do that. The question is can I cover the other 5? Okay, so let's quick recap. I covered financial performance, growth potential.
It's like a memory test.
Oh, I've done this so many times. I know. Yes, if I mess up, I will be very disappointed in myself. So yes, it's financial performance, growth potential, and cash flow were the first 3. So what are the other ones? Well, I gave you a hint at it. One of them is recurring revenue. The reasons we talked about, which is, does our business deliver a predictable flow of profit? Another one is our, hold on, now I'm tripping
I'm
myself up.
sorry, I jinxed.
You jinxed me, hold on.
Separation of.
Yeah. No, so if that's, how many is that? That's 4, right? Was that 5?
You were at 4.
I'm at 4, okay. So the other ones to talk about, monopoly control, also known as competitive differentiation. What makes our business different, special, unique? Can your buyer replicate what you do with some ease? I was quoted in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette yesterday for the ANSYS transaction. Not that I know anything about ANSYS, but as an M&A person, I said, look, a reason why some of these deals can be quite successful or attractive is because of the acquisition of talent and then also an acceleration in the market. So chances are Synopsys, after their 7-year partnership, with this giant company, said, we can still capitalize on something special in that business. When it comes to customer satisfaction, which is another measure, we'd like to see objective measures. So something like a net promoter score, or you can have Google reviews, or it's not just an opinion, there's actual quotes or testimonials that aren't paid for. We can take a look at your social follows, all those things that sort of comprise the who cares about your business. And then we also want to know, are there complaints? Has your business had complaints? And why does that all matter? Well, the more referable your business is, the lower your acquisition costs to capture new clients or not to capture new customers. And then especially in a SaaS business or recurring revenue business, we got to look at the flip, which is churn. So in one of my chapters, we talked a lot about, both sides of this coin. It's not only your customer satisfaction measurements, it's the customer acquisition and knowing some of the key things, especially if you're a SaaS business around the relationship between CAC and LTV. We can nerd out on that. And then also the churn measures. Hub and spoke is a really important one. This is a measure around owner dependency. And there's really a lot of factors that go into what we call the hub and spoke challenge. It could be, potential solutions, but you can sort of see, like, if your business cannot thrive without you, how many hours a week are you working? And are you the only one who can kick the machine just where it needs to be kicked? And, does anyone else in your business deliver the product or service, or, on and on and on. If kind of all roads lead to you for problem solving and that type of thing, well, chances are you don't have, you have a lot of owner dependency issues and therefore all these risks that we were talking about earlier. So that's hub and spoke. And then I think my 8th is kind of related to that. Am I on 8? Yeah, keeping track here. Is this what we call the Switzerland structure, which is also about identifying risks and mitigation of those risks. And the top 3, this is like a big one because there's 3 underneath it, are employees, customers, and vendors. So let's say in your old life that, your provider of yeast, your provider of yeast.
Yeah.
In the COVID time, I'm making this up, but in the COVID time could not deliver and you were single sourced from that one provider. That presented a big risk to the business because we couldn't get the product we needed. Well, we see that in construction when they couldn't get lumber,
Mhm.
couldn't get steel, where prices are, so when we're single threaded in any particular way, it presents risk. So examples, we just talked about vendor and suppliers, right? You could also see how that could be an issue, even on tech. What happens if in part of your tech stack, think about Apple and AT&T. There was a big screwing over, or no, it was Facebook and Apple. And there was a change of code and it really disrupted Facebook's revenue. I think their stock plunged like 24% one day, a couple of years ago because of the change from Apple. So that's an example on the vendor side. And you can see how these risks can play out on the employee side too, because you, by the way, might be one of the risks in the business. If you have a very owner dependent business and if your people are, you've done so many good things in your old business, we can talk about that, but like it's all, there's so many factors that go into employee risk. And I want you to realize that you might be part of that risk bucket. But it's also your key people. And so, yeah,
You got all 8,
I got all 8. Yeah, whew, thank goodness.
Serena. Or let's go to the back and then Serena, okay.
Thematic problems that you see between kind of comparing 2 million, 5 million more bracket as to, let's say, 5 to 20 and beyond. What main problems are you see?
So the question is what problems are we seeing in the market? And, some of that is economic factors and kind of where we are in the labor market. A lot of owners and CEOs are talking about talent challenges. And it's really hard to get good people. It's hard to keep good people. So I think they're since the days of the lights being switched on, we've all had people challenges. I mean, that's never going to go away. But I think in particular that bubbles up to the top. It also depends on where the company is in its life cycle. One of the things I talked about in Meredith's class when I was a guest speaker was that organizations are like people, and if we think about them as having a life cycle, you're born, you're in the startup garage, you're an adolescent, you're a toddler, you're an adolescent, you're a young adult, you're an adult, and then you're a mature adult. Now, for me, working in 125-year-old companies, that's a mature adult, right? And I've also worked in startups, so I've kind of seen all the way through this, so stick with me on this analogy. It's possible that mature companies are struggling with change, right? They're struggling with how the market's being disrupted. They're struggling with many things, they could be struggling with the 4 kind of top things that I deal with in my world, which could be, how am I thinking about succession of my leadership? How am I thinking about succession of ownership? What contingency things do I have in place? What happens if there's a death? What happens if there's, a dissolution of the business? What happens if there's a disaster? Nobody planned for COVID, right? But disaster does happen. The more sophisticated a business is to have resources to deal with some of those things, we tend to see that in the more mature companies. So I think the answer to your question is a complicated one, because I really do think that it ranges from where you are. Where is that business today? Where does it want to be? Then the chart the graphic, if you can kind of picture it, is like this bell curve, okay? And I guess I'm in a mirror image of you. So the upside is this green, feels good, right? We're growing. And then this red side coming down into the death valley. That feels terrible. Nobody wants to be there. And it is possible to come back over. And I think for many companies that are in this mature stage, innovation can be a really exciting way to try to do that. And that was one of the things that drew me to the Corporate Startup Lab class as an instructor, was what difference innovation can make in mature companies.
One of the, I guess, unlikely things that came up just in my education during our transaction was the impact of geography. So I know a business now that's in part selling because of the impacts they are fearing around climate change and their location, but they're in such a sexy area that the pool of buyers is just stronger. Whereas, if you're in a less desirable geographic area, even if the business fundamentals are there, you might just have a smaller pool of buyers that are willing to make an investment in particular geographies. Which is certainly, something to consider if you're thinking about establishing a company somewhere.
It's a really good point. Yeah, geography stitches in with the financial performance of the aspects of your industry geography. We can see different multiples for companies in different regions.
Yeah.
For just the reason you said.
We had more questions. Serena?
So this is on the other side of what we're talking about. So right now, like, I want to ask more about you both being on the seller side, for your own companies, like, were you planning on selling your company, or is it just like the right buyer, the right person came along? And then two, like, what actually is the process of selling your company? Like, how long does it take? Like, you sort of just talked about like the 8 things that they look for assessment. Do these people already know these things sort of by the time they show up, or are they like asking you for all that paperwork? And like, what makes you even want to consider like giving them a lot of this really personal information about your business? And also, is there a way that you, I don't want to say like tweak, but like if you are actually trying to sell your business, you want to present everything in the best light possible. So like, how do you do that if maybe like that there's a shortage of like some widget down the line that like you don't technically want them to maybe know about in like selling your company to them?
There's so many questions in that one
Yeah.
question, so I think we'll have to kind of piece it out, but I think you should answer this, and you should probably repeat the question to some extent.
Okay, let's start with the first question, which is, what does it mean and look like to sell a company?
Yeah.
How long does that take? What's the process? So what you can talk about the broad and I can do the specific. Okay, so I'll tell you what my experience was, which actually I don't think is too far afield of maybe the broad outlines of how most transactions go, even though every transaction is unique and all of that. When we started the company, we had no intention of ultimately selling it. We expected to hand it down to our daughter. And we built it with that sort of long-term mindset. And that started to shift at some point. And we could see a future where the business and the people that were a part of it would really benefit by far more capital than we were willing to raise or put into it. And it was really ready to expand in a way that we knew we were not the people for a variety of reasons to do that. So we started thinking about putting together a plan to sell 3 years before we actually sold it. Part of me taking a full-time role at Tepper was actually part of that plan. That was a way that not only did it force us internally to build leadership roles to replace me, but it was also a very outward expression of independence, right? This independence that Laurie discussed, so that by the time we got to the sales process, I said, I'm a full-time faculty member at Carnegie Mellon, and I couldn't do that if I were running the business day to day. So we spent several years really focused on building a leadership team, and we were really thinking about mitigating risk there. So we didn't, we had a person in mind that we thought this person would be a great CEO, this person would be a great COO, this person would be a great CMO, and they could, if we lost one of those, we're gonna skill build across the team so that there's not a big gap. So we actually focused on a leadership team of 7 people. Not all of them were, but there were people under them that could easily fill in. And that took several years to build. And it really, you have to remove all ego during that process, right? And the business does, just like you read, become much better operating, a much stronger operating business without the founder owner meddling in everything we learned. at the point where we were very confident that our leadership team was very capable and doing a great job, we started reaching out to advisors, to bankers, interviewed, like I said, 7. And I'll tell you, we went with one who, it was a firm out of Chicago, and he showed up at the meeting and he had done, you sort of go through this process of redoing your financials to do all the work of the add backs and all of that. And he had done all of that work for the first meeting. And we were so impressed by that, because most of the time, the bankers show up at the first meeting and they just like want to walk you through what the process is. It's like their normal sales pitch. And we were like, I know, we've heard this 6 times. He was a corporate lawyer. I teach our business school. Don't give us the 101. We want to dive right in, you know, and that is just, that's not the way they operate. But the guy that we ended up with, he dove right in. And he also didn't charge a retainer. He was the only person we talked to that didn't charge a retainer. And our transaction was actually quite complicated because of all the licensing and regulation. And we saw this risk that it would take a long time to get through the process. And the retainers are not insignificant. And so we liked that about him too. So we moved forward with him. We signed an agreement with them that has a commission structure that's largely tiered based on what the final result is. And you pay a certain commission on, you know, the first X million, a different commission on the next X million, so far. But I had this dream that we would find someone of significant means who had local ties. And you know, what you get with an advisor, like the kind we worked with, is you get their national network of potential buyers, right? So you get however 1,000 many they have in their database. I asked our advisor to give me 6 months to do my own meetings because I was very impressed with his database. Sure, there's lots of great potential acquirers in there, but I felt like I could tell our story better to people who had regional ties. So every week I just set up lunches with people that I thought would be great fits. And we had a number of folks that came to the table as a result of that process. And then he pressed go on his process. And then at the end, we had sort of both of those pools of people together at the end. And that took, we started the marketing. I started the marketing on my end in September. He pressed go maybe around December. We ended up with a pool of offers in the spring, April or May. And then we did not close until, I mean, I think we signed an agreement in June and did not close until December 31st. So the whole process took 18 months once we got going. Yeah. Is that typical? What do you think?
That's a longer, you had regulatory issues, so.
Yeah.
That's
I've
why,
been able to close in the summer,
yeah,
not for the
I
regular.
mean, 18 months is probably on the longer side. Deals can be done in shorter time, 6 months, sure, it's possible, right? 9 months, 12 months. I think 12 months is pretty typical, but again, you were dealing with, you know, when I talk about transferability, right? The licensing is such an important example of something that needed to be transferred and it had to go through its own process.
Yeah, and that actually knocked a number of people out of the process, which was, you know, I think one of my friends who is a classmate at Tepper, who's an investment banker, when we started, he said, you know, just get ready for an emotional roller coaster. And that's certainly what it was for a year and a half. You just, every day someone new enters, maybe someone else leaves. It's just as uncertain as everything else in entrepreneurship. So it's an emotional and tumultuous year.
Yeah, and you still had to run the business and you still had to
Yes.
teach and you still had,
And the
you know.
business still has to be doing well.
Yeah, still has to do, you
It
cannot take your
still
foot
has
off
to
the
be
gas.
doing well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know we're coming up on our time. Are there any other
Yeah.
questions from the chat?
Great. One last one from Linda.
I guess like with what you guys have seen of this industry, what are some of your hopes for what disruptive change or like what innovation might be able to change this process for both
Oh my God, Linda, thank you for asking this. Because I have been hoping, and I said this in class this morning in Lean, that someone would take on, from Carnegie Mellon, someone would take on this space, a marketplace for this space. There are so many complexities around that. And I mentioned this morning, there is a startup that Y Combinator backed, maybe 2 years ago, a year or two ago, that's trying to solve for this matchmaking. That is such an inefficient whisper almost process, or you're relying on a single advisor's network, their single database. It's a terrible way to transact, right? It's very inefficient. We're not achieving maybe the best values for these companies. And the like really small like options, like there are websites like buybusiness.com and it's all garbage, right? Like, okay, if you want a pizza shop, maybe, but then everyone knows the pizza shop is for sale, right? It's a terrible solution. So there's an opportunity there. And Linda, it's up to you to figure it out.
There are some that are trying to solve it, but it's a highly fragmented market because, you know, the information exchange, it's just an imperfect information exchange today. And so, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think there's a disintermediation, you know, potential, but it's a big market, a big challenge. Because if you think just for baby boomers, right, those folks retiring who don't have a successor in the family, the kids don't want it or whatever. I mean, just that population alone, we call it the age wave. And then you've got kind of the next generation, which would be mine, which would be the Gen Xers, who within the next 10 years are going to be in the same boat. And then there's the everyday entrepreneur who's like, well, I want to do something different, right? And so regardless of age, it's more about life stage and what we choose to do. And then those companies will be available for the next owner.
And a lot of them don't have the independence between the owner, founder. And so what an opportunity for you all, if you're willing to be an operator in one of these, you could be truly the solution to the succession plan. Or the lack of succession. Thank you guys for joining us.
Great
today.
questions.
Yeah.
Really
and
fun.
I'll see some of you shortly in class.